Today I'm going to walk you through the technical test that I did when I got my first Flutter job. We have here, it's a fake store with a fake API. We have a login screen that's going to authenticate. And it goes to another screen. I can scroll products, and this is built on demand, so it's very efficient. Then I click and I have a detail screen. Now, this looks simple, and it is simple. And the point is that it's not a hard test to do. I think most programmers could do something like this, but you're going to have to do many design choices on this project, and it's going to reveal who you actually are. I think it's really important for you to really think about how you're doing it, because solving it is a given. It's more about how you're doing it. This is the README on the GitHub. Now, this is the final project with all the code, so if you want to take a look at it, we're going to be building this from scratch. I'm going to show you every step of the way. So I think it's important for you to write a README when you finish the test, because think about it, like try to make the life for the reviewer easy, because the reviewer might be reviewing like 10 technical tests. So if you write a pretty well-written README, walk through the app, what you did with it. So I did like features here, right? What it does, the architecture I chose. We're going to be doing clean architecture. If I'm reviewing a candidate and that candidate didn't use an architecture, like the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm not going to bother anymore. Because if you don't use an architecture, that means that you are raw dogging your code. You're not thinking too much long term. So it's really important to use an architecture. In this case, I'm using clean architecture. Don't worry if you don't know much about it. I'm going to explain along the way. If you're interested, I'm going to do another video on it, so subscribe. And I chose also block, and I'm giving my reasoning why. And then I'm using getIt for the dependency injection. I'm using Dio for the networking, and I'm using a linter called Very Good Analysis, which I think is really good. I find the default linter to be too permissive, and the platform tested. So let's get into it then. Now it's a quick overview of what dependencies do we have. So you have to install block, Dio, Equatable, Flutter block, gap, and getIt. I'm also using, like I said, I'm using here on the analysis options. Very good analysis. I really recommend you doing this. It's gonna be way more rigid, but it's gonna make your code so much better, more organized. Now, what I did here was I created all the folders beforehand, because otherwise it's gonna be breaking the flow too much. I'm going to give you all the folders, so you can pause now and you can create all these folders beforehand, so we are not breaking the flow with folders. Don't worry if you don't understand what clean architecture is, presentation domain, what entities are. I'm going to be explaining every step of the way, so stick with me and it's going to be worth it. We are going to be using dummy JSON as the fake API for our store. Like, it has a ton of endpoints. It's really complete. I love this fake API, but we are only going to be using two endpoints. We have this login and get token, and we are going to use the products get all products. So these are the two ones we're going to be using. Let's take a look into auth first. Is the first thing we're going to do. So now I have the endpoint here. We know that it's a post method with HTTP. We have the headers, content type application JSON, and we have an example of the username and password. So what I did was I put all of this inside Postman, because I think it's really important to test your endpoint. So if you don't know Postman, it's really easy. Download, it's free. If we send the JSON here with the right endpoint and as a post, we are going to get this. Now, we're not going to be using this response. We're only going to use authentication. Like, this is useful if you want to create like a profile screen where you show the name, the email, the photo. But right now, we are not going to map this. Now that we know how the endpoint works, we can get to work. A brief overview of clean architecture. It's basically three layers here. We have data, domain, and presentation. Presentation is where the UI lives with the block, right? Everything the user sees. The domain is where the business logic is, the entities, the use cases. And the data is basically the data sources, right? This is where you make the networking calls and everything. Now, the point of clean architecture is separation of concerns, maintainability, but it's really about the dependency inversion principle, which means that the inner layers don't depend on the outer layers. They don't even know what's going on the outer layers. And we do that by using interfaces, not depending on concrete implementations, right? That's how we connect the layers. That makes it very flexible. You can change implementations, you can make tests in a way that is way better than just coupling together everything, right? So that's really the point. So we are going to start with the repository. We are going to create a user auth repository, and this is an abstract class. I'm going to call it user auth repository. Now, this is the contract between the domain and the data layer, right? And it's also going to be called in the use cases. So I'm going to say it's a future of type void because we're not returning anything. And I'm going to call it user auth. Now, we know that we need a string username and a string password, both required. Then we go to the use cases. Now that's going to be called a user auth.dart. Another class, but this one is an abstract. I'm going to inject the repository here. User auth repository. We're going to create a constructor for this, required. And then I'm going to create another function. That's going to be a future void, also called an user auth. It's going to be required, a string username. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to return, and I'm going to call the repository that we just did. So user auth repository dot, so we can access. Oh yeah, we are missing here a password. I'm going to call it the user auth. Then we are passing the username and the password. And we're going to come back later because we are going to put this user case inside of the block, but I'm not going to see block right now. So let's leave it as is. And now we're going to go into the entity. Now the entity is where you are basically declaring, okay, what are we sending to this endpoint? So I'm going to create a user auth entity.dart. And now we know that we can see here that we have this username and password. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. Final string username and the final string password. Let's create the constructors. What we have to do also is I'm going to create a toString method, because if you want to print this to the console, if we don't do a toString, it's just going to print like instance of user auth. We won't be able to print what it is. Now we are going to go into the data layer and we're going to create user auth repository implementation.dart. We are also going to create a user auth data source. Now this is an abstract class and we are going to create a contract. I'm going to say it's a future of type void user auth network. We have a required string username and a required string password. And now we go into the user auth repository implementation. And I'm going to create a class user auth repository implementation that implements the user auth repository. Now the user auth repository, if you remember, it's in the domain class. It's this file right here. It's this interface. You realize what we are doing is the arrow points inwards, and it's all depending on these interfaces. It's this user auth repository. We go to the user auth repository implementation and we implement that class. We're going to have to all create an override, and now we have the implementation. Now we're going to inject the user data source that we just created here. We're going to inject it here in the constructor. So I'm going to do a final user auth data source, and we are going to create a constructor. I come here and I say await the user auth data source dot user auth network, and I'm passing in the username and the password. Now I'm going to create the implementation of this interface. It's called a user auth data source implementation.dart. We create the class and we implement user auth data source. And now we have, obviously it says we need to override, right? We have to give the implementation. And now this is where the actual networking call is going to be made. I'm using Dio as our client here to make the network requests. So in the class, I'm going to say a final Dio client is equal Dio. I'm creating a instance of Dio here. It's here, now I can import. I'm going to go into base options object. And here, like, we can see that in the API, it's saying that we need to send this content type application JSON in the headers. So now we go into Visual Studio Code. We're gonna send this in the headers. Now I'm gonna go into the function. I'm gonna do a try already because I have to test this. So I'm gonna do a try, catch, and inside this, because we have to do exception handling, now we need the URL, call the DO client with a post request. We pass first the URL, and we have a data argument. Now this is what we're gonna send in the body. We have to send something here. We know it's a JSON. It's this right here. We have to send this. Remember when we created the entity? We created this entity, and now we need a model. Now in the data layer, I'm going to create a model, user auth model.dart. Now we're gonna create it, user auth model, and it's gonna extend the user auth entity. If you realize, right, clean architecture separates a lot of the concerns. So each class is doing one thing. The entity is defining what is the object, and now the model is like the implementation of it, right? So we're gonna create a constructor called to super, calling the super constructor here, sending these arguments. And the important thing here is that we have to create a toJSON method, because we can't send like a dot object directly on the call, because like the server doesn't know what to do with it, right? The point of JSON is it's an interchangeable format, universal. So I'm going to create a function that is a map type string dynamic. Now we're going to call it toJSON, and inside I'm going to return a map, and we're going to do, it has a key of username, comma, then password. If you realize, this is exactly the same thing that we have in Postman. I can go back to the user data source implementation, user auth model. I'm sending the username and the password. Lastly, I do have to apply our function to JSON. Exception handling. Now, this is a crucial thing for you to get right, because if I'm reviewing an application, like I'm reviewing this technical test, and I see poor or no exception handling, the chances of you getting the job is extremely low, because you can't just program for the happy ending. We are going to create an exception handler function. First, I'm going to create my own custom exception. So in this custom exception, I'm going to implement exception. What I need is, it's a string message. This is the error message. I'm gonna create the constructor. What I'm gonna do is I have to override this toString method. And the reason I create this custom exception and not just throw an exception, like a regular exception, because the regular exception has like this exception in front of it. I don't want to display this to the user, right? I don't want this to the user, like this is not useful. I just want the message. And now I'm going to create our handler, which is going to be called the deal exception handler.dart. The point of this is that I'm centralizing the exception handling, because what you should not do is, let's go back to the user data source implementation. Let's say you manage all the errors at this level here. We are gonna also do the products, right? We're gonna do a request of products, and now you're gonna be repeating yourself. You're gonna be checking all these errors here, and then you're gonna have to copy and paste to the other call. And then imagine you have like 50 calls in an app, and you are repeating yourself everywhere. If you wanna change something, you have to change in 50 different places. So it's really important for you to really think about the details. This is a little bit long, so I'm not going to type this by hand, but I'm going to explain it. But this is too long to be typing one by one. What DO does is it wraps the normal exception in a DO exception. And I'm using a switch statement to check. Is it a connection timeout? Then I give this message. Is it a send timeout? I give this message. Right? I'm checking most common errors here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into the user data source implementation, and I'm going to return the DO exception handler dot handler exception. Oh yeah, sorry, I have to throw this. It's not a return. So I'm throwing this error. So now I have successfully managed the errors in a centralized way. Now there is a more sophisticated way to do this. You could do this with DO interceptors, which is recommended for like large apps. It has several advantages, but I'm not going to go through it here because it's going to be too long. If you're interested in DO, let me know in the comments. I can do a deeper dive into it. But for this technical test, this is a solid implementation. So now we have basically the data, the domain layers already done. I have installed this plugin called Block. You're gonna need it to create the boilerplate for you. So I'm gonna go into presentation, the block folder, right click, and a new block. And this is gonna be called auth. Now what it does is it creates all the files for you, the block, the event, the state. If you haven't used block, there's no problem. I'm gonna explain to you. So now that we have the boilerplate created, let's start with the states now. So we know we have an initial state. You also have auth loading state. I like to add the word state always because when I'm like using the autocomplete from the VS Code, I know it's a state. So I'm going to extend auth state. Now I also have a success state and I have a failure state. Now I know that in failure I need a message payload because I have to like what is the error, right? So I'm gonna create that. Now get the props here and the message. Now the props is important because that's how Block knows if the state has changed. It overrides the equality operator. It can compare values, so that's a good way to know. So that's why it uses equatable. And in the event, we have to create a user auth, what I call the trigger event. It extends the auth event. Now this is the payload that the user is gonna send. It's gonna make more sense when we are in the app, like in the UI. So stick with me here for now, but it's gonna make way more sense. Final string username, final string password. We're gonna load in the constructor. Let me bring the override here. I have to do username, password. I don't know why it's not warning me. It should be warning me. Generally, it shows here that says you have to implement the override. I don't know why it's not doing that in this case, but you have to implement the props. That's it for the event. Now we're gonna go into the block itself, and I changed this to state. So let's change the name here. Now this is where we are going to bring the use cases. Final user auth use case. Now we have to add the parameters, right? We have to load it into the constructor, but I'm gonna do required and named. Now the linter tells me to move this before other members, so it's more organized. We are gonna do now the block. So first change the event to the trigger event. Now we're gonna bring from the event the username, event.username, and then we do a final password equal event.password. This is basically like the real user input from the event that's gonna be triggered in the UI. So now I can call in the use case and I'm sending in from the event the username and the password. Oh yeah, it's an await here. So now we have to emit auth success state. Now I'm also going to emit the loading state. We should now put this inside a try catch so that we can manage the errors. So let's do a try and now a catch. Now I'm gonna ask if E is equals to an exception. Remember the one we created. And then I'm going to emit auth failed state, and then I'm putting the message is gonna be e.message. Now we're gonna do the UI. So let's get to pages here. Let's create a login page.dart. We are gonna need a stateful widget for this. We need to create form key because we are gonna be using a form. This is gonna allow us to save the state of the form, basically like the password and the username fields. Oh, sorry, this doesn't go here actually. This goes in the state. It's not inside the build method. It's outside because it has to keep state. And then we create a string username and then a string password. I'm doing it privately with the underscore. What I have to do here is I'm gonna start the simulator. Now we have the simulator running. We have to go to the main because it's just a placeholder and I wanna pass our login page actually. Going back to login page, let me try a scaffold here. Yes, now we have the white, so we know it's connected. We need to add a widget called form. This form is gonna allow us to check like the password field and the email field, but we have to pass in the key we created. So we're passing the form key here. And then we're going to create a column and we need to create both fields. So we are gonna use something called the text form field, which is specially created for this kind of stuff. So I don't know why it's black. Oh yeah, I got rid of the scaffold somehow. Now the scaffold is back, it's white. Now in the text form field, first we do the onSaved. When the form is saved, what we have to do is getting that variable that we created earlier, and I'm saying username is equal this new value. We are gonna do a validator. Now the validator is important so we can check if it's empty or not. So it's the little details like this that if I was a reviewer, I'm gonna test this stuff. It should not allow the user to send like an empty username. So what I'm gonna do is if the value is null or the value is empty, then I'm gonna return a string called field cannot be empty. And then else we can just return null if it passes. Let's do decoration. We're gonna pass a input decoration, and then we're gonna do a label text that's gonna be called username. So now let me do a hot restart here. Let's see if it's showing up. There it is. Let's click it. Does it do something? Oh yeah, it's working. I'm gonna change the main axis alignment to center. I don't want it to be on top like that. That's better. I don't like this touching the walls, so I'm gonna do a padding. You should care about how it looks. I mean, it's not the priority, but you should have a little bit of attention to detail. So now it's not so much on the walls. There is a ton of like customization you can do. Now we copy the text form field, and I'm going to paste because it's the same thing basically. Now we have the label text as password. Yeah, now we have username and we have password. Right now, you could just do this and call it a day, right? But I don't think the password should be visible. It's those little things because, like I said, the project is not really that hard, but it's the attention to detail that you have that's gonna put you ahead. I'm going to create a Boolean flag called isVisible. It's gonna be false by default because there's a really cool argument here called obscure text. And you can see that it accepts a Boolean. So I'm gonna do isVisible. Also, we have to change the onSaved to be password, not username. We can create a little icon, just like the real apps do. We go to the decoration, we go with suffix icon. I'm gonna pass an icon object. It's gonna be icons.visibility. You have now the little button. It's not doing anything yet. That's why now you need to do something called, I love this widget, it's called the gesture detector. Oh yeah, we have an error here because this cannot be const. Now we have something called the onTap. What we're gonna do is we're gonna call setState and we're gonna say isVisible is equal not isVisible. So this is going to switch between true, false, true, false. And now we can come here in this and we can do something really cool. And we use the ternary operator. So if the isVisible is true, we do icons.visibility. But otherwise, if it's false, we do iconsVisibility off. Now if I click, it turns on and off. And then it's going to obscure the text. Pretty cool, right? Now we have to do a login button. Now that we have this column here, let me close this. Now, obviously that in a real project, you would be committing all of this. I really recommend you to commit in a professional way because the reviewer might look at how you commit. So you should be committing often and be detailed. So now that we have these text fields, I'm going to create a elevated button. Let's leave this empty for now, and we're gonna do a text, and let's do a login. Now, I like to use, I want a little bit of space. I'm gonna use the gap package. What I love about the gap is the gap knows if it's a column or a row, so it automatically adds. So instead of doing like sized box horizontal, side box vertical, so you can do this gap stuff and it's like magical. Look, I can do the gap and it's done. Now we have to check if the form key dot current state validates. The validate means that it passed these validators that we did before, right? So it's gonna check, oh, is it empty? Did it validate? Otherwise, it's not gonna pass. We check if it's gonna validate, and if it does, we do something called the form key dot current state dot save. So this is gonna trigger this onSaved argument, right? It's gonna save the values inside those variables. And now remember that we are using block. Now we need to send this because now we have the values, right? We have the username, we have the password. Now we need a way to send this payload to block, and we do that with the events. I'm gonna do a block provider.auth, and you have to say which type it is. So it's auth block, and it's gonna add. I'm gonna do .add, then I add the event auth user auth trigger event, and I'm sending now the username, and then I'm sending the password. It's gonna trigger this event, and the event of the block is a stream. So the add, what it does is it's adding this event to the stream, and it's gonna trigger it. When we go back to our block, this is where the event.username comes from, right? Because we are in the user auth trigger event. We still have to do something more. We have to do the navigation, right? So I'm gonna create a page here real quick. It's gonna be a products page.dart, a stateless widget, products page. I'm gonna do just a simple scaffold. We're gonna do a column with a text, just so I can see if it's working or not. I'm gonna say products page, right? This is just a placeholder until we do the real work. Now we come back to the login page, and block has something really cool that is called the block listener. Because block is based on streams, so it's listening to the states. So I have to say which block and state am I listening to. I can check the states. Now, if the state is auth success state, which means we are authenticated, we are going to do a navigator.push. We add here the material page route. It has a builder, and now we have to choose the page, and the page is the products page. Let me update this. Oh yeah, now like we have to provide the block, right? What's going on here, this error is could not find the correct provider auth block above this block listener. So what block does is it's looking for the block above, like in the widget tree. So since we're not providing the auth block, so it can't listen to anything. So now what we need to do is we go to the main page. I'm gonna do a multi-block provider because I know I'm gonna need it, because I'm gonna have two providers. Oh yeah, I have to actually do a block provider. Now I do the block itself, right? Auth block. We are gonna have a dependency injection with getIt, but I'm gonna show you why I'm using that by doing the default way. So now we know that the block has these user auth use cases, right? So we need to bring these user auth use cases. And then this has another dependency. The user auth repository has to bring the user auth repository implementation. But then we have another one that is the user auth data source implementation. So now you see what the problem is. Like, this works. Let me test it. Let me restart the app. Now let me try do like the correct credential here. See, it's working. Here it says products page. So now this is working. You could do this. You could leave it as is. But now imagine the problem if you have like 5 or 6 providers here, and you're gonna have this like testament of, and this is inefficient, because what if I have to access these dependencies elsewhere on the app? So I'm gonna have to create instances of it everywhere. That's not efficient. So instead of doing this, I'm gonna use the getIt package, and you're gonna see how much better it is. And these are the details that's gonna make you stand out. Now we go to the getIt injection folder and we create a init injection.dart. We create a global variable that is equal the getIt.instance. Then we create a function type void called init injection. We're gonna leave this empty for now. I go back and I'm gonna create another file that's gonna be auth dependencies.dart. This is where the magic happens. So it's a future type void as well called auth dependencies, and now we're gonna use this global variable is where we're gonna register the block and the dependencies. I'm gonna use the cascade operator to register factory. This we're gonna use it to register the block. It's called auth block. And now this is also called the service locator pattern. What we're gonna do is we're gonna reference the same variable, and I'm gonna keep now registering, but now I'm gonna register a lazy singleton. Now, what happens with the lazy singleton is it's going to generate this dependency on demand only when it's needed, and then with the singleton means it's only going to generate once, which makes it extremely efficient way to create dependencies. And now we are going to register as we can see, the user auth use case. We're going to register the user auth use cases. Now we have another dependency, and I'm going to reference the SL, and then register lazy singleton. But now I have to register, as you can see here, it's a user auth repository, right? So I have to register the user auth repository implementation. And now, as you can see, the implementation has another dependency. And then I'm gonna, again, reference this variable. And I'm gonna do then register one last time the latest singleton, which is gonna be the user data source implementation. It's recommending me replacing with a tier off, so I'm going to replace it. Now that we have this, let me add some trailing commas here so it's a little bit prettier. These two objects, I have to specify the type, otherwise it gives me a bug. So I'm going to specify that this is a user auth repository, and I'm going to specify that this is a user auth data source. And what we have to do is we go back to our init injection, and I'm gonna do a await auth dependencies. So now that I have this, I'm gonna go to the main, and before the app is started, I'm gonna load these dependencies. I'm gonna do an await, and then we're gonna do the init injection. Now, instead of doing this monstrosity where I'm just doing like every single time I'm gonna have to do this, it's very long, very inefficient, and I can replace it with our elegant dependency injection. So now I'm gonna do SL. I have to specify the type. It's gonna be auth block, and now that's it. Now it's provided, and let's try again. And as you can see, it works the same. But now I have a dedicated dependency injection system, and this is going to give you a lot of points with reviewer. I want to show like an error message, because the problem right now is I'm doing like a wrong credential here, and I do login and then nothing happens. And something has to happen, because if I see a test and you're not showing the user if something's wrong, for me that's an immediate disqualification. We can't leave the users in the dark. I'm gonna use the same block listener. We will be able to check the state and then show it a snack bar, which is a pretty convenient way to doing this. So we're gonna do an else if the state is auth failure state, which means that it's not logged in. I'm gonna do a scaffold messenger.auth context.show snack bar. I pass a snack bar object, and in the content we're gonna pass a text, and we're gonna do state dot. Just a second here, I think I have to. Oh, I think it's state dot message. Yes, I got confused. So yeah, the state dot message. Now let's see what happens. Let's see if it's working. So I'm gonna do a wrong one. See, now I'm showing a wrong password or username. Try again. And if I have something empty, look, it said, oh, field cannot be empty. You not only have to manage these exceptions, you have to show a friendly message. Like, if it shows here like an extremely long, obscure error, that means that you're not thinking about user experience. Now we are done with the login page. We are ready to go to products. So click over here to go to the second part. See you there.